Hi, Aaron. Thank you for participating in this course of Reptilia. I know that you are passionate about history, especially about the history of herpetology. Who do you think that were the European herpetologists who contributed the most to the modern herpetology?
Well, I think certainly at the beginning of the 19th century, you had people like J.G. Schneider, whose Historia Amphibiorum really described about 100 species across many different groups, and really was one of the works that set the stage for the rest of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And but typical of his time, he never traveled. So everything he worked with was material that was already sitting in a museum someplace. You also had, of course, beginning around 1825, you had John E. Gray in London, who published more than 1,000 papers, mostly in herpetology, and described hundreds of species. But again, although he had the advantage of the growing British Empire to send material in, he really never went anyplace himself either. And really, Wilhelm Peters in Germany was one of the first, because he spent 5 years in Mozambique and other parts of Africa, and again described more than 600 species of amphibians and reptiles. But in his case, his opinions were informed by having knowledge of what these animals were like in the field. And so around that time, his activity started in the 1840s, 1850s. Around that time, I think you see this transition to a more modern view of species that takes into account at least a little bit about what the biology of the organisms is, and some recognition that there's variation and those sorts of things. And of course, Dumerel and Biberon, or the two Dumerels and Biberon in France, who really...
Why two Dumerels?
Father and son.
Father and son.
Father and son, and then Gabriel Biberon as an assistant. Really was a dynasty in France that did the first truly comprehensive coverage of the complete herpetofauna of the world as it was then known, really published from the 1830s through the 1850s. So it was a huge project that took many years, and really was the first truly global attempt to bring together what was known about amphibians and reptiles. But of course, they too were limited. They didn't go to the field, and it was very, very typical. So Peters was an exception for that century. But Dumerel and Biberon certainly ushered in the modern era in the sense that they really critically evaluated all that had come before. And so many of the old synonyms that existed were recognized as synonyms and pulled out of the literature at that time. So before their time, nobody really had such a global view of herpetology that they could actually do something with this. So Dumerel and Biberon, or the two Dumerels and Biberon, were certainly very critical in that regard, and sort of they and Peters overlapped in their period of activity, but the Dumerels, especially the senior Dumerel, of course, spanned back to the 18th century and had a long life, and really was maybe one of the most important transitional figures, going from just the post-Linnaean time up to the sort of early modern period of herpetology. So I think, as you move on into the second half, and especially the latter part of the second half of the 19th century, you get to people like Günther at the British Museum, who was German, but the British Museum at that time was importing its herpetologists. First Günther from Germany, and then towards the latter part of the century, Boulanger from Belgium. And Boulanger certainly would be sort of the epitome of the 19th century herpetology. He worked incredibly quickly. Within just a few years of the time that he arrived in Britain, he had finished the fish catalogs for the British Museum and the amphibian and reptile catalogs, and had done this really substantial job describing many, many new species, and working.
He was a workaholic.
Workaholic, for sure. I mean, working at a time before there were even typewriters. All of his manuscripts were handwritten and turned into the printer, and he was just incredibly fast, incredibly accurate, and also a very astute taxonomist. He paid attention to detail, but his catalogs of the British Museum, published mostly in the 1880s and 1890s, really represent kind of the culmination or the summary of what was known about world herpetology at the end of the century. So although he didn't have the detail that Dumeril and Biberon included in their herpetological work, Boulanger took into account this last part of the century when the increase in number of species was tremendous. Because if you think of this time period, the 1870s, 80s, 90s, it's the opening up of Central Africa, it's the opening up of New Guinea, it's the opening up of many parts of the world that no collecting had been done before. So this brought in hundreds and hundreds of new species. I mean, certainly, you have a huge number of very competent herpetologists who were mostly museum-based and mostly working on material that was brought into them. And so when you look at the neotropics and where material was coming in, although Boulanger, for example, as well as Gunther, described many things from the neotropics. Gunther, of course, was the author of the reptile section of the one of the largest Central American studies that was done, and Dumeril, along with Beaucourt, published the Mission Scientifique, which looked at Mexico and Central America. Oh. So certainly a lot of work going on there. But the interesting thing about a lot of the work in Latin America was, of course, that the Spanish colonial power was already out by the time you have the sort of herpetological opening of the world. And so unlike the British Museum or the Paris Museum or the Berlin Museum, you didn't have this sort of dominance of a single European herpetologist or European institution that was receiving all of this material. So as a consequence, in comparison to many parts of the world, the neotropics material was being described by people from all over. And of course, once you get to the beginning of the 20th century, you start to have more people who are active in the Americas themselves. But in the 19th century, you have people in Britain, people in France who are describing these things. And quite a few in Germany. Is very active work being done in Germany. People like Oskar Böttger at the Senckenberg Museum, or J.G. Fischer in Hamburg, were amongst the people who were describing important collections from throughout the Americas. So major works on material from Brazil, major work on material from Colombia, a lot of monographic works that were completed, usually on the basis of just one or two large collections that were sent back to Europe at the time. Paracca in Italy was another example, who worked extensively on material from the Neotropics. So, Carl had left Europe with his family and arrived in America, and Carl's brother told me the story that Carl's father told him that he would support him through his studies as long as he promised to get a degree that he could support a family on. He had to do something practical. And so Carl became an engineer. But then he realized already, before he became an engineer, he realized that biology was his true love. But of course, this was what made Carl Gans special, was that he was trained as an engineer and really was one of the first modern biologists to take an engineering approach and bring that into biology and bring that into biomechanics. And really, before Carl's time, the field of biomechanics was a much more limited field. But this was what Carl's major contribution was to take this engineering approach and ask questions about how do animals function. And luckily for herpetologists, Carl's major interests were in reptiles in particular, although he did work on things like chewing in mammals and a variety of other topics, but certainly the majority of his contributions were in reptiles, and especially, of course, in burrowing reptiles, which also had the advantage not only of taking an engineering approach to burrowing, which is an obvious sort of question that one could apply this engineering approach to, but also taking what were some of the least known groups of reptiles. Burrowing reptiles traditionally have always been very poorly known, difficult to study, especially to understand what they do in life. And Carl's interest in amphisbaenians in particular, but also other burrowing reptiles, really elevated these animals to the point where I think if you had asked even herpetologists, many herpetologists in 1930, what they knew about amphisbaenians, they would know almost nothing. And Carl brought this group into the mainstream of herpetology. It became something that a group that every year people were publishing on amphisbaenians, mostly Carl at that time, but also other people. Carl also, of course, was a major contributor to the physiology of reptiles, and worked extensively to understand questions about the aspects of ventilation and breathing in reptiles, issues of muscle function, at everything from the cellular level up through whole muscle systems, looking at the peculiarities of things like how turtles deal with carrying out their normal physiology when they don't have intercostal muscles to move the ribs. Those sorts of things were also major contributions of Carl. And I would say that certainly by the time that I was a graduate student in the 1980s, if you had asked 100 herpetologists around the world, who is the most important herpetologist, you would have had 90 or more of those 100 unambiguously say, well, Carl Gans. Carl is the most important and most well-known herpetologist.
Yes, and thanks to that knowledge, encyclopedic knowledge and varieties of approach to the reptilia, he was the editor of a monumental work, The Biology of Reptilia.
But in the biology of reptilia, really still stands. I think Carl envisioned it as something that would be of lasting value. And even though the first volumes came out in the late 1960s, these are still volumes that at least I would know that you and I and others who are interested in morphology still return to those volumes. You still go back and use those volumes. And that's, I think, what makes the biology of the reptilia stand out, is It wasn't complete. It didn't cover every topic. Some topics were never covered in Carl's lifetime. It was a little bit idiosyncratic. Sometimes the chapters strongly reflected the interests of the particular authors rather than being a broad overview. But the thing that really stands out is that the lasting value, the fact that these were written in such a way and edited by Carl and solicited by Carl in such a way that 20, 30, 40 years later, these contributions still have lasting value, and they still are a source that people can go back to. And of course, Carl also, mentioning his editing, was for decades the editor of Journal of Morphology. And so those two things together, editor of Biology the Reptilia and editor of Journal of Morphology, combined really put him at the center of the world when it came to both of those topics, both reptile biology and morphology or anatomy in general.